The tranquilizer gun trembled in Sheriff William Harrison's frost-bitten hands as Montana's worst blizzard in decades howled around the old Miller barn. Through the swirling snow, he could see Thunder, the massive German shepherd, crouched protectively over 15 small forms huddled in the hay. "Don't do this, Bill," Ethan Miller pleaded, his prosthetic leg sinking deep into the snow as he stepped between the lawman and the dog. "They're just babies." Harrison's weathered face contorted with 8 years of buried pain. So was Rebecca. The wind carried the distant howl of something wild from the forest edge. Thunder's ears pricked forward, her amber eyes never leaving Harrison's face. She knew. Somehow, she remembered him too. "Some storms never truly end, Ethan," Harrison whispered, his finger hovering over the trigger. "They just keep coming back." 3 weeks earlier, none of them could have imagined it would come to this. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Cedar Falls. Montana had always been the kind of place where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone was hurting and where everybody knew everybody's business, sometimes whether you wanted them to or not. Population 2,147, nestled between snow-capped peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself, it was a town that had weathered the closing of the lumber mill, 3 harsh winters in a row, and enough heartbreak to fill the Continental Divide. The Miller family lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, where the paint was peeling just enough to show character, and the front porch creaked with stories from 4 generations. Ethan Miller, 42 years old with prematurely gray hair and hands that still bore burn scars from his firefighting days, walked with a slight limp that reminded everyone, including himself, of the school fire 3 years back. He'd saved 11 children that day before a burning beam crushed his left leg. The prosthetic that replaced it below the knee worked just fine, but some mornings the phantom pain still woke him up in a cold sweat. His wife, Grace, possessed the kind of steady presence that made her perfect for her job as an ICU nurse at Cedar Falls General. At 38, she carried herself with quiet strength, though those who knew her well could see the shadow that sometimes crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. She'd lost her first pediatric patient 6 years ago, a little girl who'd come in from a car accident, and though she'd saved hundreds of lives since then, that one small face still haunted her dreams. Madison, 9 years old with her father's stubborn chin and her mother's compassionate eyes, had always been different. She seemed to understand things that other children missed, could read the moods of adults and animals with uncanny accuracy. Her younger brother Tyler, 7, lived in a world of colors and shapes that he captured with crayons and paintbrushes, creating artwork that often surprised the adults around him with its emotional depth. And then there was Thunder. The German Shepherd had come to them 4 years ago as a traumatized puppy, pulled from the debris of a tornado that had torn through the eastern part of the county. Ethan found him whimpering beneath the collapsed roof of an old farmhouse, one ear torn and hanging by a thread of skin. The vet had wanted to put him down, said the psychological damage was too severe, but something in those amber eyes had spoken to Ethan's own wounded soul. Thunder grew into a magnificent dog, 90 pounds of muscle and loyalty, with a black and tan coat that gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight. But the tornado had left its mark. He counted. Every night, without fail, Thunder would make his rounds through the house, checking on each family member before settling down to sleep in the hallway between the children's bedrooms. He hoarded food in secret places around the house and would grow agitated before storms, pacing and whining until the weather passed. The first week of January brought whispers of the worst winter storm in a generation. Grace noticed Thunder's restlessness increasing, and when she ran her experienced hands over his body during their evening routine, she felt the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, calling the family together. "Looks like we're going to have some additions to our household. January 15th arrived with the kind of bone-deep cold that made the trees crack like gunshots in the night. The National Weather Service had been warning about the storm for 3 days, using words like historic and life-threatening. But folks in Cedar Falls had heard it all before. What they hadn't expected was for thunder to go into labor right as the first snowflakes began to fall. Grace was the first to notice something was wrong. Thunder had been restless all afternoon, pacing between the kitchen and the back door, whining softly and refusing her dinner. When the contractions started around 6 o'clock, just as the wind began to howl through the pine trees, Grace's medical training kicked in immediately. "Ethan, we need to move her to the barn," she called out, already gathering clean towels and blankets. "She's going to need space, and if the power goes out, which it will, we'll need somewhere we can keep her warm." The Miller barn had been built in 1952 by Ethan's grandfather, solid as a church and twice as dependable. They'd converted part of it into a workshop years ago, but the main section still held the sweet smell of hay and the memory of simpler times. Ethan carried Thunder out through the driving snow, her weight solid and trusting in his arms, while Madison and Tyler followed with armloads of supplies. "Is she going to be okay, Daddy?" Madison asked, her voice small and worried as Thunder settled into the nest of blankets they'd prepared. "She's strong, sweetheart," Ethan replied, though he could see the strain in Thunder's amber eyes. "Your mama delivered plenty of babies at the hospital. She knows what she's doing." The first puppy arrived at 7:23 p.m., slipping into the world during a lull in the wind that made the moment feel almost sacred. Thunder cleaned her baby with gentle efficiency, and the tiny squeaks that filled the barn brought tears to Grace's eyes. Madison clapped her hands together in delight while Tyler immediately began sketching in his ever-present notebook. "One down," Grace murmured, checking Thunder's condition. "Feels like there might be more in there." More was an understatement. Over the next 6 hours, as the storm raged outside and the power flickered on and off, Thunder gave birth to 14 more puppies. By 2 in the morning, the barn was filled with the soft sounds of new life, and the Miller family sat in amazed silence, counting and recounting the tiny forms nestled against their mother. 15, Ethan whispered, shaking his head in wonder. "I've never seen anything like it." Word spread through Cedar Falls despite the storm. In a town where good news was as precious as summer sunshine, a miracle birth was cause for celebration. Mrs. Patterson from next door braved the snow in her bathrobe and boots, followed by the Hendersons from across the street, then the Kowalskis from the corner house. By dawn, nearly 20 neighbors had gathered in the Miller barn, sharing thermos coffee and marveling at Thunder's remarkable litter. But even in those first magical hours, there were signs that something was different about these puppies. Their eyes opened on the 3rd day instead of the usual 10 to 14 days. Some were noticeably larger than others, with sharper features and a more angular build. Their vocalizations were unusual, too, not the typical high-pitched whines of newborn puppies, but sounds that were almost wilder. Thunder's behavior was the most telling change. She'd always been protective, but now she exhibited an intensity that bordered on fierce. She wouldn't let anyone near certain puppies, positioning herself between them and visitors with a low, warning growl that raised the hair on everyone's arms. She seemed to be separating them somehow, keeping 7 of the puppies slightly apart from the other 8, as if she knew something the humans didn't. "That's odd," Grace observed on the 4th day, watching Thunder carefully move 3 specific puppies to a different corner of their enclosure. "It's almost like she's sorting them." Dr. Sarah Chen arrived that afternoon for what should have been a routine post-birth checkup. Sarah had been the town veterinarian for 12 years, had delivered hundreds of litters, and prided herself on her professional composure. But as she examined Thunder's 15 offspring, her brow furrowed with concern. "How fast did you say their eyes opened?" she asked, lifting one of the larger puppies. The little one's cry was sharper than she expected, and its teeth, barely visible, seemed more developed than normal. 3 days, Ethan replied, noticing the worry in Sarah's voice. "Is that bad?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She examined each puppy carefully, noting the variations in size, build, and behavior. 7 of them were clearly different from the other 8, larger, more alert, with facial features that seemed somehow more angular, more wild. "I'd like to run some tests," Sarah finally said, her professional mask firmly in place. "Just to be thorough. Sometimes when litters are this large, there can be complications." But as she gathered her things to leave, Thunder's behavior became even more protective. The German Shepherd positioned herself directly between Sarah and the 7 puppies she'd been guarding, her amber eyes fixed and unblinking. "It's almost like she knows something we don't," Sarah murmured, and for the first time in her career, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January cold. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning that dawned crisp and clear, the kind of winter day that made Cedar Falls look like a Christmas card. Dr. Sarah Chen had driven to the Miller house personally rather than calling, which should have been Grace's first warning that something was seriously wrong. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The manila envelope beside her elbow seemed to pulse with unspoken dread. Ethan and Grace sat across from her, while Madison and Tyler played with the 8 gentler puppies in the living room, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension in the kitchen. "I've been a veterinarian for 12 years, Sarah began, her voice carefully measured. "I've seen birth defects, genetic abnormalities, unusual litter sizes, but this?" She opened the envelope and spread the test results across the table. 7 of Thunder's puppies aren't fully domestic dogs." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Grace felt her nursing instincts kick in, the same clinical detachment that had gotten her through countless medical crises. Ethan's hand found hers across the table, his calloused fingers squeezing tight. "What do you mean, not fully domestic?" Grace asked, though part of her already knew. "Wolf-dog hybrids," Sarah said quietly. "The DNA shows clear markers from gray wolf genetics. Thunder must have mated with a wild wolf sometime last spring." She paused, glancing toward the living room where the children's voices could be heard. Under Montana state law, wolf-dog hybrids are classified as exotic animals. They require special permits to own, and in most cases, she couldn't finish the sentence. In most cases what? Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. "They're required to be destroyed." The coffee cup slipped from Grace's nerveless fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor in a spray of ceramic and cold coffee. In the living room, Madison's voice called out, "Mommy, are you okay?" "We're fine, sweetheart," Grace managed, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "Keep playing." Sarah leaned forward, her expression pained. "I'm required by law to report this within 24 hours. Once I do, the state wildlife officials will come. They'll want to examine the entire litter, and they'll take the hybrids." She swallowed hard. "Ethan, Grace, I'm so sorry." "Which ones?" Ethan asked, his firefighter's training helping him cut straight to the practical issues. "Which 7? Sarah pulled out a second sheet with small photos attached. "The larger ones. The ones Thunder has been keeping separate." She knew. Somehow she knew which of her babies were different. Through the kitchen window they could see Thunder in the backyard, playing gently with the hybrid puppies while keeping a watchful eye on the purebred ones near the porch. Her maternal instincts had been trying to tell them something all along. 24 hours, Grace repeated numbly. "I can maybe stretch it to 36, Sarah said. But after that, if I don't report it, I lose my license and someone else will come anyway. Anonymous tips have a way of finding their way to the authorities. That afternoon, as if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing, Sheriff William Harrison pulled into the Miller driveway in his official vehicle. At 52, Harrison carried himself with the weathered authority of a man who'd seen too much and learned to expect the worst. His badge had been polished that morning, but his eyes held shadows that no amount of professional duty could erase. Ethan met him at the front door, blocking the entrance with his body. "Bill?" "Ethan." Harrison's voice was carefully neutral. "Got a call about some unusual dogs out here. Mind if I take a look?" "Actually, I do mind." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. They'd known each other since high school, had served on the volunteer fire department together before Ethan's injury, had shared beers and barbecues and the comfortable camaraderie of small-town life. But this was different. This was official. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Harrison said quietly. "You know I have to check this out." "The hell you do." Ethan's voice rose slightly, drawing Grace to the doorway behind him. "Those are family pets, Bill. That dog saved my kids' lives more times than I can count." Harrison's expression flickered, just for a moment, and something passed across his face that looked almost like recognition. "Your German Shepherd, Thunder, right? How long have you had her?" 4 years, since she was a puppy." "Big dog, black and tan, torn left ear?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about her ear?" Harrison didn't answer directly. Instead, he stepped around Ethan and walked toward the backyard where Thunder was playing with her litter. The moment the German Shepherd saw him, she went absolutely still. Their eyes met across 30 feet of snow-covered yard, and something electric passed between them. "Well, I'll be damned," Harrison whispered. Thunder approached slowly, her tail wagging tentatively, her amber eyes never leaving his face. When she was close enough, Harrison knelt down and she pressed her massive head against his chest, whining softly. "You remember me, don't you, girl?" Harrison's voice broke slightly. 8 years. 8 long years. Ethan and Grace exchanged confused glances. "Bill, what's going on?" Harrison stood slowly, his hand still resting on Thunder's head. "This dog tried to save my daughter's life 8 years ago. Rebecca fell through the ice on your pond during that cold snap in February. She was only 6 years old." He paused, his throat working. "This dog, she was just a puppy then, jumped in after her, pulled her out onto the ice. But it was too late. Hypothermia, then pneumonia. Rebecca died 3 days later." The weight of shared tragedy settled over the yard like a blanket. Grace remembered now, the little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile who'd been brought into the ICU all those years ago. She'd been one of the ones Grace couldn't save. "Your wife," Grace said softly. "Margaret. She came to see me at the hospital. She thanked me for trying." "Margaret killed herself 6 months later," Harrison said matter-of-factly, though his hands trembled as he petted Thunder. "Couldn't live with the guilt. Thought it was her fault for letting Rebecca play outside." He looked up at them, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I blamed everyone. The ice, the weather, God, even this dog for not being faster, not being stronger." Thunder whined again and licked Harrison's hand as if she remembered that terrible day too. "But she tried," Harrison continued. "This little puppy risked her own life to try to save a child she barely knew. And now," he gestured toward the hybrid puppies playing in the snow, "now the state wants me to destroy her babies because they're part wild." In that moment, the lines were drawn. On one side stood duty, law, and the weight of regulations designed to protect public safety. On the other stood love, loyalty, and the recognition that sometimes the most important truths couldn't be found in any rule book. Harrison stood up slowly, his decision made. I need to see all of them, the whole litter, and then we need to talk. The town hall meeting was called for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, but by 6:30, every seat in the Cedar Falls Community Center was filled, and people were standing 3 deep along the walls. The air hummed with tension and the kind of nervous energy that comes before a storm breaks. Word had spread through the small town like wildfire. The Miller family's miracle puppies weren't what they seemed, and now the government wanted to destroy them. Mayor Patricia Hendricks, a 70-year-old woman who'd been running Cedar Falls for the better part of 2 decades, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. She was flanked by Sheriff Harrison, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week, and Dr. Chen, whose usually composed demeanor showed cracks of stress around the edges. "We're here to discuss the situation regarding the Miller family and the recent discovery about Thunder's litter," Mayor Hendricks began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I want everyone to remember that we're neighbors here. We'll conduct ourselves with civility and respect." The crowd murmured its agreement, but the undercurrent of emotion was unmistakable. In the third row, Ethan and Grace sat with their children, Thunder lying calmly at Madison's feet. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, her amber eyes alert but peaceful. Old Henry Kowalski stood up first, his weathered hands gripping his wooden cane. At 83, he was the town's unofficial historian and moral compass. "I've lived in Cedar Falls my whole life," he said, his voice steady despite his age. "I remember when we had wolves in these mountains regular-like. They weren't monsters. They were just trying to make a living, same as us." "That's easy to say when you don't have children to protect," shot back Janet Morrison, a young mother whose twins attended school with Madison and Tyler. "Wolf-dog hybrids are unpredictable. They're stronger and more aggressive than regular dogs. What happens when one of those puppies grows up and decides a child looks like prey?" The room erupted in competing voices. Some shouted agreement with Janet's concerns, while others defended Thunder's gentle nature. Mayor Hendricks banged her gavel repeatedly until order was restored. Grace Miller stood up slowly, her nurse's training helping her project calm authority. "Thunder has been part of our family for 4 years, she said clearly. "She's never shown an ounce of aggression toward our children or anyone else's. When Madison fell through thin ice last winter, Thunder pulled her out. When Tyler wandered off during that camping trip, Thunder tracked him down and stayed with him until we found them both. This dog has saved lives." "But what about her babies?" Janet persisted. "Even if Thunder is gentle, that doesn't mean her wild offspring will be." Dr. Chen stood up from her position at the front table. "I've been observing the hybrid puppies for 2 weeks now," she said. "Yes, they're developing faster than normal domestic puppies, and yes, they show some wild behaviors. But they also show remarkable intelligence and strong pack loyalty. Thunder has been teaching them discipline and social boundaries just like any mother dog would." From the back of the room, a gruff voice called out, "What does the law say?" It was Frank Bradley, who owned the hardware store and served on the city council. "I love Thunder as much as anyone, but if the state says these animals are dangerous, don't we have an obligation to protect our community?" Sheriff Harrison stood up slowly, and the room fell silent. Everyone knew about his personal tragedy, though most had never heard him speak of it publicly. "The law says wolf-dog hybrids are exotic animals that require special permits or must be destroyed," he said. "But the law also says I have discretionary authority in how I enforce certain regulations, especially when public safety isn't immediately threatened." He paused, looking directly at the Miller family. 8 years ago, I lost my daughter Rebecca to a tragic accident. What most of you don't know is that Thunder, when she was just a puppy, tried to save Rebecca's life. She risked drowning to pull my little girl from the icy water." His voice cracked slightly. "The law would have me destroy the offspring of the animal who tried to save my child." I'm having a hard time seeing the justice in that." The room was completely silent now. Even Janet Morrison looked shaken by Harrison's revelation. Madison Miller stood up, her 9-year-old voice clear and strong. "Thunder taught her babies to be good," she said simply. "The wild ones play different than the regular ones, but they're not mean. They're just more careful, more aware." She looked around the room at all the adult faces staring at her. "If we kill them just for being different, what does that make us?" Her words hung in the air like an indictment. Tyler, not to be outdone by his sister, held up his sketch pad. The drawing showed Thunder surrounded by all 15 puppies, but in the child's artistic vision, they were all the same. Not different colors or sizes, just one big family. "They love each other," Tyler announced. "That's all that matters." Old Henry Kowalski thumped his cane on the floor. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said approvingly. "These children understand something some of us adults seem to have forgotten. Family isn't about bloodlines or genetics, it's about love and loyalty and protection." Mrs. Patterson, Thunder's biggest fan among the neighbors, stood up next. "I've seen Thunder in action more times than I can count," she said. "When my grandson Billy broke his arm falling from that old oak tree, Thunder ran 2 blocks to fetch Grace before any of us adults even realized what had happened. When the Hendersons' house caught fire last spring, Thunder woke up the whole neighborhood with her barking. That dog has saved more lives in this town than most humans have." The testimonials continued for another hour. Story after story of Thunder's heroism, intelligence, and gentle nature. Children who'd been comforted by her soft fur after nightmares, elderly residents who'd been helped when they'd fallen, lost pets who'd been found and brought home safely. But the legal reality remained unchanged. State wildlife officials had been notified and were expected to arrive within 48 hours. The hybrid puppies would be confiscated and destroyed, regardless of the community's feelings on the matter. "What if we found them homes outside Montana?" suggested Rebecca Taylor, who ran the local animal rescue. "Maybe in states with more lenient laws about wolf-dog hybrids?" Dr. Chen shook her head sadly. "Interstate transport of unregistered wolf-dog hybrids is a federal crime. The moment we cross state lines, we'd be involving federal authorities, and that would make things worse for everyone." "What about a wildlife sanctuary?" asked another voice from the crowd. "Same problem," Dr. Chen replied. "Licensed sanctuaries won't take animals with questionable legal status. It puts their own permits at risk." The meeting stretched past 9 o'clock, with emotions running high and solutions seeming increasingly impossible. Through it all, Thunder lay peacefully beside Madison's chair, occasionally lifting her head to study the faces around her as if she understood that her family's fate was being decided by these passionate humans. As the crowd finally began to disperse, small groups formed in the parking lot, continuing their debates under the cold January stars. Some argued for strict adherence to the law, while others spoke of civil disobedience and protecting what was right over what was legal. Ethan and Grace walked home with their children and Thunder, the weight of the community's division heavy on their shoulders. Behind them they could hear the heated discussions continuing, neighbors and friends taking sides in a way that threatened to tear the close-knit community apart. "What's going to happen to Thunder's babies?" Madison asked as they reached their front porch. Grace knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we'll face it together as a family." Thunder whined softly and nuzzled against Grace's shoulder, as if offering comfort in return for all the kindness she'd received. In the barn behind their house, 15 puppies slept peacefully, unaware that their very existence had become the center of a battle between law and love, between fear and compassion, between the safety of conformity and the risk of acceptance. The next morning, brought unexpected visitors. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the Miller house just after dawn, their government plates and official insignia making their purpose clear. Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks had arrived ahead of schedule, accompanied by federal agents whose presence elevated the situation to a whole new level of seriousness. Agent Patricia Coleman, a stern woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and no-nonsense eyes, knocked sharply on the Millers' front door. When Ethan answered, she held up her badge and identification. "Mr. Miller, I'm Agent Coleman with Fish, Wildlife and Parks. We're here regarding the reported wolf-dog hybrid animals on your property. We have a legal seizure order." She handed him an official document. "We'll need to examine all 15 animals and remove those that test positive for wolf genetics." Behind her, 6 additional agents and veterinary technicians unloaded equipment from their vehicles, transport cages, tranquilizer guns, and testing apparatus that looked more suited to a military operation than a puppy examination. Thunder appeared beside Ethan in the doorway, her hackles raised and her body tense. For the first time since the Miller family had known her, she looked truly dangerous, not aggressive but protective in a way that spoke to her wild heritage. "Ma'am," Ethan said carefully, "those puppies are only 3 weeks old." "They're still nursing." "We're aware of that," Agent Coleman replied coolly. "We have facilities equipped to handle orphaned wildlife. The hybrid animals will be humanely euthanized after examination. It's the most responsible course of action." "And Thunder?" Grace asked, appearing behind her husband with Madison and Tyler clinging to her arms. "The mother will be evaluated. If she shows no aggressive tendencies and tests negative for rabies and other diseases, she may be allowed to remain with the domestic puppies. However, given that she mated with a wild wolf, her judgment regarding human safety is now in question." Madison burst into tears, and Tyler pressed his face against his mother's side. Thunder's whine grew louder, and she positioned herself protectively in front of the children. That was when Sheriff Harrison's patrol car pulled into the driveway, followed by what looked like half the town of Cedar Falls. The standoff in the Millers' front yard had all the makings of a small-town revolution. Agent Coleman and her federal team found themselves facing not just the Miller family, but what appeared to be half of Cedar Falls' population. Cars lined Maple Street for 3 blocks in either direction, and people kept arriving, some carrying homemade signs reading "Save Thunder's Family" and "Love Over Law," others simply standing in silent solidarity. Sheriff Harrison approached Agent Coleman with his hands visible and his demeanor carefully professional, though everyone who knew him could see the tension coiled in his shoulders. "Agent Coleman, I'm Sheriff William Harrison. I wasn't aware federal agents would be involved in what should be a local wildlife matter." "Sheriff Harrison," Coleman replied, her tone clipped and efficient. "When wolf-dog hybrids are involved, especially in numbers this large, it becomes a federal concern. These animals pose a significant threat to public safety and livestock in the area." From the crowd, Henry Kowalski's voice rang out with surprising strength for his 83 years. "Threat to public safety? That dog has saved more lives in this town than some of our emergency responders." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered townspeople. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, clutching a manila folder. "Agent Coleman, I have documented here 12 separate incidents where Thunder has alerted people to danger or directly intervened to prevent harm. House fires, medical emergencies, lost children. This animal is a hero, not a threat." Coleman barely glanced at the offered documentation. "I appreciate your community's attachment to these animals, but federal regulations exist for good reason. Wolf-dog hybrids are unpredictable and potentially dangerous, especially as they mature. We've seen too many cases where seemingly gentle animals have attacked without warning, and we've seen cases where government officials have destroyed innocent animals based on fear rather than fact." Grace Miller said, stepping forward with Madison's hand firmly in hers. As an ICU nurse, she was accustomed to speaking with authority in high-stress situations. "I've worked in emergency medicine for 15 years, Agent Coleman. I know the difference between genuine threat assessment and bureaucratic overreach." Behind the federal agents, their vehicles hummed with idling engines, ready for a quick departure once the seizure was complete. The transport cages gleamed coldly in the morning sunlight, each one large enough to hold several 3-week-old puppies. The sight of them made several people in the crowd visibly emotional. Tyler Miller broke free from his parents and ran toward Thunder, wrapping his small arms around her neck. "You can't take them," he shouted, his 7-year-old voice cracking with tears. "They're our family." Thunder immediately positioned herself protectively around the boy, her amber eyes fixed on the federal agents. Her body language was unmistakable. She would defend this child with her life if necessary. Agent Coleman's hand moved instinctively toward the tranquilizer gun on her belt. "Sir, please remove your child from the vicinity of that animal. We don't know how it will react under stress." "I know exactly how she'll react," Ethan said firmly, limping forward on his prosthetic leg. "She'll protect my son because that's what family does. Same way she tried to protect Sheriff Harrison's daughter 8 years ago." Coleman's eyes flicked to Harrison, noting his reaction to this information. The sheriff's jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "Is that true, Sheriff?" Coleman asked. Harrison nodded slowly. "That dog pulled my 6-year-old daughter from an icy pond. Risked her own life trying to save Rebecca. Didn't matter that Rebecca wasn't packed. Didn't matter that she was human. Thunder saw a child in danger and acted. And yet your daughter died anyway," Coleman pointed out with clinical detachment, "which only proves that wild instincts, however well-meaning, are no substitute for proper emergency response protocols." The words hit Harrison like a physical blow, and several people in the crowd gasped at the agent's callousness. Madison Miller, still holding her mother's hand, looked up at the federal agent with the kind of clarity that only children possess. "My daddy says people who hurt others are usually hurt inside themselves," Madison said clearly. "Are you hurt inside, ma'am?" Agent Coleman's professional composure flickered for just a moment, a flash of something almost human crossing her features. But she recovered quickly, turning back to her team. "We have a job to do here. I need the mother dog sedated and the puppies separated for examination." That was when Thunder's behavior shifted dramatically. She had been protective but calm throughout the confrontation, responding to her family's emotional state with typical German Shepherd sensitivity. But now, as the federal agents began unloading their equipment, something deeper awakened in her. Not aggression, but an ancient instinct that recognized true threat. Thunder's low growl rumbled through the winter air, and every person in the yard could feel it in their bones. Her hackles rose fully, making her appear even larger than her 90 pounds. But most unsettling of all, from somewhere deep in the forest that bordered the Miller property, an answering call echoed back, wild and haunting and unmistakably wolfish. "Well, I'll be damned," Dr. Chen whispered. She had arrived with the crowd of townspeople and now stood near the federal agents, her veterinary expertise lending weight to her observations. "Now, that's not a dog's call for help. That's pack communication." Agent Coleman's team heard it too, and suddenly, their casual efficiency became sharp alertness. Tranquilizer guns were checked and loaded. Radio communications crackled with requests for backup. "Agent Coleman," Dr. Chen continued, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I think you need to understand what we're dealing with here. Thunder isn't just a domestic dog who mated with a wolf. Based on what I'm observing, she was likely raised by wolves as a young puppy and then separated from her pack. Her behavior patterns, her vocalizations, her protective instincts, they're showing both domestic and wild characteristics in perfect balance." From the forest edge, approximately 50 yards away, shapes began to emerge. First one, then two, then three gray forms moving through the snow with the fluid grace of predators, not threatening, not approaching, but present, watching. Jesus Christ, one of the federal agents muttered, his hand tightening on his weapon. Nobody move suddenly, Harrison commanded, his law enforcement training taking over. They're not aggressive, they're just interested. The largest of the wolves, a magnificent gray female with intelligent amber eyes remarkably similar to Thunder's, stepped partially into the clear space at the forest edge. Thunder whined softly, a sound filled with longing and recognition, but she didn't leave her position protecting Tyler. "That's her pack," Madison said wonderingly. Thunder's real family came to help. Agent Coleman's radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Coleman. We have a developing situation here. Multiple wild wolves on scene, requesting immediate backup and wildlife specialists." The response was immediate. "Coleman, you are to withdraw immediately if the situation has become unsafe. Do not engage with wild wolf pack." "We can't withdraw," Coleman replied tersely. "We have civilians on scene, including children in close proximity to a potentially dangerous hybrid animal." But even as she spoke, the absurdity of the situation was becoming apparent. The wild wolves showed no sign of aggression toward the humans. They were focused entirely on Thunder and presumably her offspring. If anything, their presence seemed to be calming Thunder rather than exciting her. Old Henry Kowalski, leaning heavily on his cane, began walking slowly toward the wolves. Several people called out in alarm, but Henry waved them off with surprising authority. "I've lived in these mountains for 83 years, he called back. "Worked logging camps when wolves were still common in these parts. They're not here to hurt anyone. They're here for family." He stopped about 20 feet from the gray female and sat down carefully on a fallen log, making himself appear smaller and less threatening. The wolf studied him for a long moment, then looked past him to Thunder and the crowd of humans surrounding her. Dr. Chen was taking careful notes on her phone, documenting everything. "This is unprecedented," she murmured to Grace Miller. "I've never seen wild wolves interact peacefully with humans like this. It's as if they understand that Thunder has chosen to live with you, and they're respecting that choice." Agent Coleman's radio crackled again. "Coleman, report your status." She looked around the yard, at the 3 wild wolves maintaining their respectful distance, at Thunder protecting the Miller children, at the entire town of Cedar Falls standing united in defense of one dog's family, at Sheriff Harrison, whose personal tragedy had become entangled with questions of justice and mercy. "Base," she said slowly, "I think we need to reassess our approach here." The federal agent's moment of uncertainty lasted only seconds, but it was enough for Thunder to make her own decision. With Tyler still clinging to her neck, she began walking slowly toward the barn where her 15 puppies were housed. Not running, not fleeing, but moving with deliberate purpose. The crowd parted to let her pass, and amazingly, so did the federal agents. Something about Thunder's dignity, her obvious intelligence, and her gentle handling of the child made even the most hardened bureaucrat hesitate to interfere. At the barn door, Thunder paused and looked back at the wild wolves. The gray female took a few steps forward, then stopped, as if asking permission. Thunder's soft whine was clearly an invitation. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Falls for generations to come. The wild wolf pack, 3 adults who had presumably been Thunder's original family, approached the barn slowly and peacefully, while federal agents, local law enforcement, and half the town watched in stunned silence. Inside the barn, 15 puppies were beginning to stir from their morning nap, squeaking and yipping with the innocent sounds of new life. Thunder lay down among them, and the wild wolves positioned themselves at the entrance, not entering the human structure but clearly prepared to defend it. "This is impossible," Agent Coleman whispered, but her radio remained silent on her belt. The tranquilizer dart struck Thunder in her left flank just as she was settling her hybrid puppies closer to her body. The sound of the compressed air gun was sharp and final in the cold morning air, and for a moment everything in the miller's barnyard seemed to freeze. The wild wolves at the forest edge, the crowd of townspeople, even the wind itself. Thunder stumbled, her amber eyes wide with shock and betrayal as she looked toward Agent Coleman, who was already reloading her weapon. The federal agent's face was set in grim determination, her radio crackling with urgent commands from her superiors who had been monitoring the situation remotely. "Target acquired," Coleman reported tersely. "Beginning extraction of hybrid specimens." "No!" Madison's scream pierced the air as she broke free from her parents and ran toward Thunder, who was swaying on her feet but still trying to position herself protectively over her babies. The little girl threw herself against Thunder's massive chest, her arms wrapping around the dog's neck as the sedative began to take effect. Tyler was right behind his sister, his 7-year-old face streaked with tears and twisted with fury. "You hurt her! You hurt Thunder!" He began pounding his small fists against Agent Coleman's leg with all the rage his little body could muster. Ethan Miller's roar of anguish echoed across the barnyard as he struggled to reach his family, his prosthetic legs slipping in the snow. "You said you'd wait for the examination. You said she wasn't the target." "Circumstances changed when wild wolves appeared on scene," Coleman replied coldly, signaling to her team to begin loading the puppies into transport cages. The animal's pack behavior made her an immediate threat to civilian safety. Grace Miller had gone into medical crisis mode, her nursing training overriding her emotional response as she knelt beside Thunder. "How much sedative did you give her?" she demanded, checking Thunder's pulse and breathing. "She's a lactating mother. This dosage could kill her." "The animal will receive proper veterinary care at our facility," Coleman stated. But even she looked uncertain as Thunder's breathing became labored and irregular. Sheriff Harrison stepped forward, his service weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. His face was ashen and his voice shook with barely controlled emotion. "Agent Coleman, I'm ordering you to cease this operation immediately. You're endangering civilians and acting outside your stated authority." "Sheriff, you have no jurisdiction over federal wildlife enforcement," Coleman replied, though her team had paused their puppy gathering activities at the sight of Harrison's weapon. "Stand down or face charges of interfering with a federal investigation." That was when Thunder made her final act of heroism. With the last of her consciousness before the sedative fully took hold, she used her massive paws to push the 7 hybrid puppies toward the barn's back entrance, where a loose board had created a gap just large enough for small animals to squeeze through. Her movements were clumsy and desperate, but her intent was unmistakable. She was trying to save her babies. The hybrid puppies, barely 3 weeks old but already showing the advanced development that marked their wolf heritage, responded to their mother's urgings with surprising coordination. One by one they squeezed through the gap and tumbled into the snow behind the barn where the wild wolves were waiting. "Stop them!" Coleman shouted to her agents, but the adult wolves had positioned themselves strategically. The moment the first puppy emerged, the gray female, Thunder's original pack leader, gently picked it up and began moving toward the forest. The other adult wolves flanked her, creating a protective corridor. Agent Coleman raised her tranquilizer gun toward the retreating wolves, but Sheriff Harrison's hand clamped down on her wrist with surprising strength. "You shoot at those wolves with children this close, and I'll arrest you for reckless endangerment," Harrison said through gritted teeth. His own tragic history with wildlife was playing out again, but this time he was on the other side of the equation. Dr. Chen had been documenting everything on her phone, and now she stepped forward with professional authority. "Agent Coleman, what you just witnessed was unprecedented cooperative behavior between wild and domestic animals. Thunder just demonstrated cognitive problem-solving and altruistic behavior that challenges everything we thought we knew about wolf-dog hybrid intelligence." All I saw was a dangerous animal teaching wild instincts to hybrid offspring, Coleman replied, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She was watching Thunder, who had collapsed completely now, her breathing shallow and her amber eyes glazed but still fixed on the barn entrance where her remaining 8 purebred puppies were crying for their mother. Madison Miller knelt in the snow beside Thunder's head, her small hands stroking the dog's ears. "She saved them," the 9-year-old whispered. "She saved her babies, even though she was dying." "She's not dying," Grace said firmly, though her medical assessment was deeply concerned. She had found Thunder's pulse, weak but steady, and was monitoring her breathing. "But she needs immediate veterinary attention." The sedative dosage was calculated for a healthy, non-lactating animal. Tyler had stopped crying and was staring at the forest edge where the last of the hybrid puppies had disappeared with their wild guardians. "Will they be safe?" he asked Dr. Chen. "The Wolf family. Will they take care of Thunder's babies?" Sarah Chen knelt down to Tyler's level, her voice gentle but honest. "Wolves are excellent parents, Tyler. They'll teach those puppies how to survive in the wild, how to hunt and how to stay safe. In some ways, they'll have a better life than they would have had in captivity." From the forest came the sound of adult wolves calling to each other. Not howls of aggression or territory, but the softer communications of a pack moving together with young. The sounds gradually faded as Thunder's original family carried her hybrid offspring to safety, deep in the Montana wilderness. Agent Coleman stood in the middle of the barnyard, her tranquilizer gun hanging loose in her hand, watching her carefully planned operation fall apart. Her radio was silent. Her superiors were apparently as stunned by the turn of events as everyone else. 7 of the target animals had been lost to wildlife, which would require a completely different kind of federal report. "What about the remaining puppies?" she asked Dr. Chen, gesturing toward the 8 purebred animals that were still nursing in the barn. "They stay with their mother," Sheriff Harrison said firmly, holstering his weapon. "Thunder is a legally owned domestic animal with no criminal record and a documented history of community service. Unless you can prove she poses an immediate threat, which you can't, she and her domestic offspring remain with the Miller family." Old Henry Kowalski, who had remained seated on his log throughout the entire confrontation, stood up slowly and approached Agent Coleman. At 83, he moved with the careful dignity of someone who had seen enough history to recognize its important moments. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 8 decades, "I've lived through the Depression, World War II, and the cultural upheavals of the 60s. I've seen what happens when fear drives policy instead of wisdom." He gestured toward Thunder, who was beginning to stir slightly as Grace continued her medical care. "That dog just taught us more about love and sacrifice than most humans learn in a lifetime. Maybe it's time we started learning from her instead of trying to destroy her." Agent Coleman looked around the barnyard, at the crowd of townspeople who had witnessed Thunder's sacrifice, at the children whose innocence had been wounded by bureaucratic coldness, at Sheriff Harrison whose personal tragedy had been reopened and somehow transformed by the morning's events. "Base, this is Coleman," she said into her radio, her voice noticeably different than it had been an hour earlier. 7 target animals have been removed from the scene by natural wildlife intervention. No human casualties. Domestic animals remaining on site pose no immediate threat to public safety. She paused, looking down at Thunder, who was trying to lift her head to check on her remaining puppies. "Requesting permission to withdraw and file a comprehensive situation report." The response crackled back immediately. "Permission granted, Coleman. Return to base for debriefing." As the federal agents packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Agent Coleman approached Grace Miller, who was still kneeling beside Thunder in the snow. "Ma'am," Coleman said quietly, I need you to know that your dog's vital signs should stabilize within the next few hours. The sedative I used was a standard dosage, but I didn't account for her recent birthing and nursing status. If you notice any signs of respiratory distress or cardiac irregularity, you need to get her to a veterinary facility immediately. It was the closest thing to an apology the federal agent could manage, but Grace heard the human concern beneath the professional language. "Thank you," Grace replied simply. As the black SUVs pulled out of the Miller driveway, Thunder struggled to her feet with Grace's help and limped slowly toward the barn where her 8 remaining puppies were crying for their mother. She was weak and disoriented, but her maternal instincts drove her forward. The entire town of Cedar Falls watched in reverent silence as Thunder settled down among her domestic offspring, allowing them to nurse while she licked each one with exhausted tenderness. Her amber eyes kept drifting toward the forest edge, as if she could still hear the calls of her hybrid children, but her commitment to the babies that remained was absolute. "She chose us," Madison whispered to her parents. "Even after everything, she chose to stay with us." 3 days passed in a haze of recovery and revelation before the truth began to emerge from the chaos of that terrible morning. Thunder had survived the overdose of tranquilizer, though she remained weak and disoriented, spending most of her time in the barn with her 8 remaining puppies. Grace monitored her condition around the clock with the dedication of both a medical professional and a devoted family member, checking her temperature, pulse, and respiratory rate every few hours. But it was Sheriff Harrison who made the discovery that would change everything. Unable to sleep, haunted by memories of his daughter Rebecca and the echoes of Thunder's sacrifice, he had returned to the Miller property on Friday evening to check on the dog's condition. What he found in the barn defied everything he thought he knew about the events of that morning. Thunder was not just alive, she was alert, responsive, and nursing her puppies with the same gentle efficiency she had shown since their birth. But more than that, she was communicating, not in the limited way that dogs typically interact with humans, but with a complexity and intentionality that spoke to a deeper intelligence. When Harrison approached, Thunder lifted her head and made a series of soft vocalizations that sounded almost conversational. She then stood carefully, nuzzled each of her 8 puppies to ensure they were settled, and walked to the back corner of the barn where she began digging at the straw bedding. "What are you trying to show me, girl?" Harrison murmured, kneeling down beside her. Thunder's digging revealed something that made Harrison's breath catch in his throat. A small, weathered collar with a tag that read "Spirit" in faded letters. It was a wolf collar, the kind used by wildlife researchers to track pack movements and behavior. But what made Harrison's hands tremble as he held it was the date on the research tag. February 15th, 8 years ago. The exact day his daughter, Rebecca, had fallen through the ice. Dr. Chen arrived within the hour of Harrison's urgent phone call, and what she told him about the collar's significance sent shockwaves through their understanding of Thunder's entire story. The collar belonged to a research project that had been tracking a wolf pack in the Cedar Falls area 8 years earlier. The pack had included a pregnant female designated as Spirit, who had given birth to 4 pups in late winter of that year. "According to the research notes I can access," Dr. Chen explained, sitting in the Miller's kitchen with Harrison and the family gathered around, Spirit's pack was displaced by human encroachment in February. The researchers lost track of 3 pack members during a severe winter storm, the same storm system that brought the ice conditions that led to Rebecca's accident. Grace poured coffee for everyone with hands that shook slightly. "You're saying Thunder was one of those lost pack members?" More than that, Dr. Chen continued, consulting her laptop where she had pulled up the research files, I think Thunder was Spirit's puppy. The collar suggests that Thunder found her way back to this area because she was trying to return to her birth territory. When she encountered Rebecca in the water, her rescue instincts weren't random, they were pack behavior. She was trying to save a member of what she perceived as her new human pack. Madison looked up from where she was sitting beside Tyler, both children having listened to the adults' conversation with the serious attention that comes when children know something important is happening. So Thunder has two families. Her wolf family and our family? That's exactly right, sweetheart, Harrison said, his voice soft with wonder. And 3 days ago, when her original pack came back for the hybrid puppies, they weren't just taking the babies. They were completing a circle that started 8 years ago when Thunder first chose to live between both worlds. The implications were staggering. Thunder had not randomly mated with a wild wolf the previous spring. She had reconnected with her original pack, possibly even with Spirit herself. The hybrid puppies represented not just a biological anomaly, but a bridge between the wild and domestic worlds that Thunder had been navigating her entire life. But why hide the collar? Ethan asked, his practical mind working through the details. Why bury it and only show it to Harrison now? Dr. Chen looked thoughtful. Dogs, especially intelligent ones like German shepherds, can exhibit remarkably sophisticated behaviors when it comes to hiding things they consider important. But I think there's more to it than that. She paused, looking directly at Harrison. I think Thunder was waiting for the right moment, the right person, to reveal her complete story. She needed someone who would understand the connection between her past and present. Harrison felt tears building behind his eyes as the full weight of Thunder's sacrifice became clear. She's been protecting both her families all this time. When she saved Rebecca, she was acting on wolf pack instincts to protect young. When she raised the hybrid puppies alongside the domestic ones, she was maintaining pack unity across species lines. And when she pushed those 7 babies toward freedom, she was ensuring the survival of her wild bloodline while staying loyal to her human pack. The revelation transformed the federal investigation as well. When Agent Coleman received Dr. Chen's report about the research collar and Thunder's documented history with the original wolf pack, her superiors in Washington demanded a complete review of the case. The discovery that Thunder was herself a research subject who had been presumed dead for 8 years changed the legal classification of both her and her offspring. More importantly, it provided scientific justification for what the town of Cedar Falls had known instinctively all along. Thunder was not a dangerous hybrid who posed a threat to human safety, but rather a remarkable example of successful interspecies adaptation. Her ability to function as both a wild pack member and a domestic family companion represented exactly the kind of behavioral flexibility that wildlife managers hope to encourage in human-wildlife interactions. The phone call from Agent Coleman came on Sunday morning, just as the Miller family was preparing for church. Her voice, when Ethan answered, was notably different from the coldly professional tone she had used during the standoff. Mr. Miller, this is Agent Coleman. I'm calling to inform you that the federal investigation into Thunder and her offspring has been officially closed. The research collar discovery has reclassified Thunder as a recovered research animal rather than an unregistered hybrid. She and her domestic puppies are free from any further federal oversight. Ethan felt his knees go weak with relief. And the 7 that went with the wolves? Those animals are now considered returned to their natural habitat under the guidance of their biological pack. The research precedent actually supports this outcome as beneficial for both the individual animals and the local ecosystem. Coleman paused. Mr. Miller, I want you to know that what I witnessed at your property has led to some significant policy discussions at the federal level. Thunder's behavior has challenged some of our basic assumptions about wildlife management. After hanging up the phone, Ethan walked out to the barn where Thunder was lying peacefully with her 8 puppies. She looked up at him with those remarkable amber eyes, and for a moment he could see both the wild intelligence that had saved his daughter from drowning and the domestic loyalty that had chosen his family as her pack. "You knew, didn't you, girl?" he said softly, kneeling down to stroke her ears. "You knew that collar was the key to everything. You were just waiting for the right moment to share your secret." Thunder's tail wagged gently, and she made that soft conversational sound that had become her way of communicating complex thoughts to her human family. Then she did something she had never done before. She rolled over onto her back in a gesture of complete trust and submission, exposing her belly in the ultimate display of vulnerability. It was then that Ethan noticed the scar. Hidden beneath Thunder's thick coat, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a long, thin line across her chest. It was old, well-healed, but unmistakably the mark of a serious injury. Dr. Chen would later confirm that it matched the type of wound a young animal might sustain from being caught in debris during a natural disaster. Exactly the kind of injury that might have separated a wolf puppy from her pack during a severe winter storm. As Ethan gently traced the scar with his finger, Thunder's eyes met his with an expression of profound understanding. She had carried the physical and emotional marks of her traumatic separation from her original family for 8 years, but she had never let those wounds define her capacity for love and loyalty. The 8 domestic puppies, now almost a month old and thriving under their mother's care, tumbled around Thunder's prone form with the playful energy of healthy young animals. They had no knowledge of their complicated genetics or the federal investigation that had threatened their existence. They knew only that they were loved, protected, and part of a pack that included both canine and human members. Madison and Tyler burst into the barn at that moment, having heard the news about the federal investigation from their parents. They threw themselves down beside Thunder, competing to be the first to hug her and tell her she was safe. "Thunder, you don't have to be scared anymore," Madison whispered into the dog's ear. "Agent Coleman said you can stay with us forever." Tyler, ever the artist, had brought his sketch pad and was already working on a new drawing, this one showing Thunder surrounded by all 15 of her puppies, with the wild wolves and the Miller family standing together in harmony. It was a child's vision of how the world should work, where love transcends species and families come in all shapes and sizes. As the afternoon sun streamed through the barn windows, Thunder settled back into her maternal role with a contentment that seemed deeper than before. She had revealed her greatest secret, survived the government's attempt to separate her from her chosen family, and successfully launched her wild offspring into their natural habitat. Most remarkably, she had managed to maintain her loyalty to both her biological pack and her human family without betraying either. The transformation was complete. Thunder was no longer a dog with a mysterious past, but a bridge between worlds whose story had become part of Cedar Falls' collective history. 6 months later, spring had transformed Cedar Falls into a postcard of renewal and hope. The harsh winter that had brought Thunder's dramatic birthing and the federal standoff was now just a memory, replaced by wildflowers blooming along Maple Street and the sound of children playing in yards where snow had once piled 6 feet deep. The Miller house had become something of a local landmark, with visitors from neighboring towns often driving by hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous dog who had bridged 2 worlds. Thunder had fully recovered from her ordeal, though she carried herself with a new dignity that spoke to her experiences. Her 8 domestic puppies had grown into magnificent young dogs, each one displaying the intelligence and loyalty that marked their mother's lineage. 7 of them had found homes throughout Cedar Falls and the surrounding valley, becoming beloved family members who carried Thunder's gentle spirit into other households. The eighth puppy, a female with Thunder's distinctive amber eyes and calm temperament, had remained with the Miller family and been named Hope by Madison and Tyler. Hope had proven to be as remarkable as her mother, showing an uncanny ability to sense when family members were troubled or in need of comfort. She had inherited Thunder's habit of counting the family members each night, but added her own ritual of checking on the elderly Mrs. Patterson next door, whose husband had passed away in March. The sight of Hope sitting patiently on Mrs. Patterson's porch every evening, waiting to be invited in for their daily visit, had become one of the neighborhood's most heartwarming traditions. Sheriff Harrison had undergone his own transformation during those months. The revelation of Thunder's true identity and her connection to Rebecca's rescue attempt had lifted a burden from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For 8 years, he had lived with the belief that he had failed to save his daughter, that all his training and experience as a law enforcement officer had been useless when it mattered most. Learning that Thunder had tried to save Rebecca, that his daughter's last moments had been witnessed by a creature who cared enough to risk her own life, had provided a kind of closure he never expected to find. In April, Harrison had done something unprecedented in Cedar Falls. He had remarried. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had become more than a veterinarian to the community during Thunder's crisis, had accepted his proposal on a quiet evening as they watched Thunder and Hope play in the Millers' backyard. The wedding had been a small affair held in the same community center where the heated town hall meeting had taken place months earlier, but this time the building was filled with joy rather than controversy. The new Mrs. Harrison had brought her own gift to the community's healing. She had established a wildlife rehabilitation center on the outskirts of town, focusing on injured and orphaned animals that could be returned to their natural habitats. The center had become a place where the town's children could learn about the delicate balance between human civilization and wild nature, with Thunder serving as an unofficial ambassador for peaceful coexistence. But perhaps the most remarkable development had been the ongoing connection between Thunder and her wild family. Throughout the spring and early summer, the wolf pack that had adopted Thunder's hybrid offspring had maintained a respectful presence at the edge of Cedar Falls. They were never threatening, never intrusive, but they could occasionally be spotted at the forest line, especially during the evening hours when Thunder would take Hope for walks along the boundary between town and wilderness. Dr. Chen's research had documented these interactions with scientific precision, creating what she believed might be the first comprehensive study of voluntary cooperation between domestic and wild canids. The hybrid puppies, now 6 months old and approaching their adult size, showed remarkable adaptation to wildlife while maintaining some of the social characteristics they had learned from Thunder during their first crucial weeks of life. On warm summer evenings, the most extraordinary sight of all could sometimes be witnessed from the Millers' back porch. Thunder would position herself at the edge of their property, with Hope beside her, and engage in vocal communications with the wild pack. The sounds were unlike anything typically heard from domestic dogs, complex vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning and emotion across the species divide. Madison, now 10 years old and more perceptive than ever, had become the family's interpreter of these exchanges. "Thunder's telling them about our day," she would explain to her parents. "She's letting them know we're all safe and happy, and they're telling her that her wild babies are growing strong and learning to hunt." Tyler, approaching his 8th birthday, had filled 3 sketchbooks with drawings of the extended pack interactions. His artwork had caught the attention of a children's book publisher who was considering turning his illustrations into a story about families that transcend traditional boundaries. The potential book deal had brought national attention to Cedar Falls, but the Miller family had been careful to protect Thunder's privacy while sharing their story of love and acceptance. The economic impact on Cedar Falls had been unexpectedly positive. The Thunder Trail had become a modest tourist attraction, bringing visitors interested in wildlife photography and animal behavior to the area. Local businesses had benefited from the increased foot traffic, and the town council had used the revenue to improve parks and recreational facilities. The old lumber mill, abandoned for 2 years, had been converted into a visitor center featuring exhibits on human-wildlife coexistence. Ethan Miller had found new purpose in this transformation. His firefighting experience, combined with his intimate knowledge of Thunder's story, had made him a natural choice to lead educational tours for school groups and wildlife enthusiasts. Walking visitors through the barn where Thunder had given birth, standing in the spot where she had pushed her hybrid babies toward freedom, he could convey the emotional reality behind the scientific data in ways that moved people to tears. Grace had returned to her nursing duties with renewed dedication, but she had also become an advocate for animal-assisted therapy programs. Thunder and Hope regularly visited the pediatric ward at Cedar Falls General, where their calm presence and intuitive understanding of human emotions provided comfort to sick children and their families. The hospital administration had been initially skeptical, but the measurable improvements in patient morale and recovery rates had made the program a permanent fixture. The federal investigation had concluded with results that surprised everyone involved. Agent Coleman's comprehensive report had recommended significant changes to wildlife management policies, arguing that Thunder's case demonstrated the need for more nuanced approaches to human-wildlife interaction. Rather than viewing hybrid animals as categorical threats, the report suggested case-by-case evaluations that considered individual behavior patterns and community integration. Coleman herself had requested a transfer to the research division of her agency, where she could focus on developing more humane and effective strategies for managing wildlife conflicts. In a letter to the Miller family, she had written, "Thunder taught me that intelligence and adaptability are not threats to be eliminated, but gifts to be understood and respected. I hope my remaining career can honor the lesson she provided." The most touching development had been the annual memorial service for Rebecca Harrison. What had once been a private affair, attended only by her father, had become a community celebration of all the lives Thunder had touched and saved. The service was held each February at the pond where Rebecca had fallen through the ice, but instead of focusing on tragedy, it had evolved into a celebration of heroism, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect all living beings. This year's memorial had included a special recognition ceremony. Thunder, now 5 years old and showing the first hints of gray around her muzzle, had been officially designated as Cedar Falls' Ambassador of Compassion by the town council. The ceremony had been simple but moving, with Thunder wearing a specially made collar bearing a medallion that read, "For teaching us that love knows no boundaries." As summer turned toward autumn, the Miller family had established new routines that accommodated Thunder's dual identity as both domestic companion and wild-connected ambassador. Evening walks now included regular stops at the forest edge, where Thunder would engage in her mysterious communications with her original pack. Hope, still a puppy but rapidly maturing, was learning these protocols from her mother, suggesting that the bridge between worlds would continue into the next generation. Madison and Tyler had adapted to their roles as children of a famous dog with remarkable grace. They fielded questions from visitors, posed for photographs, and shared their story with the understanding that Thunder's message of acceptance and love was bigger than their individual family. But they also maintained fierce protection of Thunder's privacy, ensuring that she had quiet time away from public attention. The 8 domestic puppies that had been adopted throughout the valley had remained connected to their birthplace through regular visits and playdates. The sight of Thunder, surrounded by her grown offspring, all of them displaying variations of her intelligence and gentle temperament, had become one of Cedar Falls' most cherished sights. Local photographers had captured images that graced calendars and postcards, but no photograph could truly convey the emotional depth of these family reunions. As autumn painted the Montana mountains in brilliant colors, Thunder seemed to carry herself with the satisfaction of a life well lived and a mission accomplished. She had successfully navigated between two worlds, raised two different types of offspring, survived government intervention, and demonstrated that love and loyalty could transcend species boundaries. Her story had become more than just a local legend. It had become a testament to the possibility of peaceful coexistence in an increasingly divided world. On quiet evenings, when the demands of fame and education were set aside, Thunder would still perform her nightly ritual of checking on each member of her human family. She would pause at Madison's door, listening to the sound of homework being completed. She would nose gently at Tyler's room, where colored pencils and art supplies spoke of creativity and wonder. She would sit briefly outside Ethan and Grace's bedroom, ensuring that the pack leaders were secure for the night. Finally, she would settle in the hallway between the children's rooms, with Hope curled beside her, both dogs maintaining their vigil over the family they had chosen to love and protect. Sometimes, in the distance, the sound of wild wolves calling to each other would drift across the valley, and Thunder would lift her head to listen, her amber eyes reflecting an understanding that spanned both worlds. In those moments, Cedar Falls seemed to hold its breath, witnessing the daily miracle of a love so profound that it had changed not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of what family could mean. Looking back on Thunder's remarkable journey from that snowy January night to her recognition as Cedar Falls' ambassador of compassion, we're reminded that the most profound love stories aren't always between people. Sometimes they're about the bonds that transcend species, age, and circumstance. Thunder's story speaks to every parent and grandparent who's ever worried about protecting their family, every person who's faced impossible choices between duty and love, and everyone who's discovered that real family isn't defined by blood alone. In our golden years, we understand what Sheriff Harrison learned through his pain, that healing often comes not from letting go of love, but from opening our hearts wider to include the unexpected gifts life brings us. Thunder showed an entire community that wisdom comes in many forms, that loyalty has no expiration date, and that sometimes the family we need most arrives on four legs with amber eyes and an understanding that goes beyond words. Her legacy reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, new beginnings, or discovering that love multiplies when we're brave enough to share it. The greatest miracles aren't always the dramatic ones. Sometimes they're simply the daily choice to protect what matters most. Share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced an unexpected bond with an animal that changed your perspective on family? What moment in your life taught you that love comes in forms you never expected? Please leave a comment below and share your own story of unexpected love or second chances.